In the rolling hills of Bohemia, a strange and chilling decision was made, one that would echo through history, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. A town, seemingly ordinary, vanished from the maps in 1699. But this wasn't a natural disaster or a gradual decline. This was a deliberate and eerie act, a complete erasure from the physical world. The town removed its very name from existence, cutting itself off from history, as if to flee from a fate worse than death itself. For centuries, this event has baffled historians and conspiracy theorists alike. Why would a community voluntarily disappear? What could drive a group of people to erase themselves so thoroughly, to sever all ties with the world around them? The mystery of this silent settlement begins with an unsettling decision. In an era when towns and villages were often marked as symbols of pride, identity, and survival, the act of obliterating one's own existence is not just strange, it is horrifying. It's not just a story of a town that disappeared. It's a tale of fear, secrecy, and perhaps a darker truth that no one is willing to confront. A town's name was removed, and with it, the very possibility of its survival in memory. The eerie silence that followed was thick and heavy, almost as if the earth itself had swallowed up this place and locked its secrets away forever. Some say it was a religious or political act, a form of rebellion against the ruling powers that sought to control the people of Bohemia. Others point to the supernatural, suggesting that the townsfolk were fleeing from something far more terrifying than the mundane worries of war or taxes. No matter the cause, the question lingers in the air like a spectre. What drove the people of this town to make such an extreme choice? To understand the gravity of their decision, we must first look back at the context of Bohemia in the late 17th century, a time of turbulence, oppression, and fear. The region had only recently been ravaged by the 30 Years' War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history. The war had left its scars, shattered communities, distrust, and an unspoken trauma that ran through the land like a current. The war had not just been fought on the battlefield but had seeped into the very fabric of society, eroding people's sense of security and stability. In this environment, it's not hard to imagine how a small, isolated town might have felt a deep, existential fear. This fear was not just about external threats, it was about the internal pressures that came with being part of a larger, often hostile world. The ruling powers of Bohemia were harsh and unforgiving, and the people in this remote settlement had been under the watchful eye of the Habsburgs for years. Perhaps, in an attempt to preserve their autonomy or to avoid further oppression, the villagers chose to disappear, to remove themselves entirely from the maps, the records, and the histories that define them. They opted to create their own world, one beyond the reach of those who might control their lives. But the story doesn't end there. No, the eerie nature of this decision only deepens as we explore the strange and unsettling theories that have cropped up in the centuries since. Some claim that the townspeople had discovered something, or perhaps were hiding something, that they did not want the world to know. Was there a dark secret lurking in their midst, one that could not be revealed to outsiders? Could it have been something supernatural, something that defied the laws of nature and scared them to the point of complete isolation? One of the most persistent theories is that the town was cursed. This isn't just folklore, it's a theory rooted in the local beliefs of the time. Bohemia, with its dense forests and ancient traditions, was a place where superstition ran deep. Curses, spirits, and mysterious forces were a part of daily life. The people who lived in these isolated towns often found themselves at the mercy of forces they couldn't understand. In such a climate, it wouldn't be out of the question for a town to erase itself from existence to escape something that they believed was beyond the human realm. But there are other theories that are just as disturbing. Some suggest that the decision was a result of a political or religious purge, an effort to remove a group of people deemed undesirable. This would not have been an unprecedented event during that time. The late 17th century in Bohemia was a time of severe religious intolerance, and the political climate was such that entire communities could be exiled or destroyed for reasons as simple as not conforming to the prevailing religious or political ideologies. Was this town perhaps trying to avoid such a fate by disappearing entirely? Was it an act of self-preservation, or something darker? As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that no one knows for sure. Over the years, various researchers, historians, and even amateur investigators have tried to piece together the story of this lost town. What they've uncovered, however, is far from conclusive. There are no definitive records that explain why the people of this town chose to remove their name from all maps. Theories abound, but the truth remains elusive, wrapped in layers of time and forgotten memories. One thing is certain, though, The story of the vanished town is a reflection of the fear and uncertainty that defined the era. It speaks to the fragility of human existence and the lengths to which people will go to protect themselves from the unknown. Whether it was a religious decision, a political rebellion, or an act of self-preservation in the face of something otherworldly, the town's erasure remains a symbol of the dark corners of history that have yet to be fully understood. Today, the town's name is lost to time, and only the faintest traces of its existence remain. But those traces are enough to remind us of the power of fear, superstition, and the unknown. And perhaps, just as importantly, they remind us that there are still secrets out there, secrets that have been buried for centuries, waiting to be uncovered. The mystery of the town that erased its own name from history continues to captivate the imagination, drawing people into the unsettling question of why anyone would choose such an extreme path. And as long as that question lingers, the town's silence will continue to haunt us, its story never fully told, its name never fully restored. This strange chapter in Bohemian history serves as a reminder of the mysteries that still lie hidden in the shadows of the past. It is a haunting tale of a place that chose to vanish, of people who disappeared without a trace, and of a mystery that, even now, remains unsolved. Perhaps the people of this lost town knew something we don't, or perhaps they were simply trying to escape something that terrified them beyond reason. Whatever the truth, their decision to erase themselves from history has left behind a legacy of unanswered questions. Questions that, like the town itself, may never fully be answered. The year is 1699, and the region of Bohemia, nestled within the heart of Central Europe, is a land haunted by its past and gripped by the present. The echoes of the 30 Years' War still resonate throughout the countryside, leaving behind a landscape scarred by violence, disease, and political upheaval. The once powerful and prosperous kingdom, having been torn apart by decades of religious and political strife, finds itself under the rule of the Habsburg monarchy, whose reach stretches across much of Europe. For the common people of Bohemia, life is a delicate balance between survival, faith, and the whims of the ruling elite. The scars of the war have not just left physical destruction in their wake, they have also left an indelible mark on the psyche of the population. The 30 Years' War, which raged from 1618 to 1648, decimated Bohemia and much of the Holy Roman Empire. The war was not only a brutal military conflict but also a religious war, fought between Catholic and Protestant factions. It tore through villages and cities, ravaging communities, decimating populations, and leaving a wake of uncertainty and fear. Entire towns were wiped off the map, their inhabitants either killed, displaced, or forcibly converted. It was a time of upheaval, where the future seemed uncertain and where no one could escape the violence and religious fervor that swept across the land. By the late 1600s, the war had long since ended, but the scars were still visible. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled much of Central Europe, had taken control of Bohemia, and the region had become a part of the larger Austrian Empire. Under the Habsburgs, Bohemia faced increasing centralization and attempts at assimilation, with policies aimed at imposing Catholicism and reinforcing the power of the monarchy. These policies were met with resistance in certain areas, where Protestantism still held sway and where the people felt a deep sense of autonomy that clashed with the imperial agenda. In this atmosphere of fear, mistrust, and repression, many of the rural towns and villages of Bohemia found themselves isolated from the political and religious conflicts that consumed the larger cities. Life in these small settlements was often a delicate balancing act between maintaining traditional customs and trying to survive under the watchful eyes of the monarchy. The people were caught between two worlds, the old, deeply rooted traditions of Bohemian life and the growing power of the Habsburgs, whose reach extended into every aspect of their lives. The small town that would later disappear was no different. Situated in a remote area, it existed on the fringes of this complex and turbulent world. The isolation of this town, however, was not merely geographical, it was also social and psychological. For the people living in this community, life was often harsh and unforgiving. They were surrounded by dense forests, with little contact with the outside world. This physical separation from larger centers of power likely contributed to their sense of independence, but it also made them vulnerable. Without the protection of larger cities or the political weight that came with being part of a powerful kingdom, the town existed on the margins, cut off from the broader currents of history. It was a place where superstition ran deep, where old customs and beliefs held sway, and where the people were bound together by a shared sense of isolation and, perhaps, fear. The isolation of the town may have been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it allowed the residents to live their lives relatively undisturbed by the outside world. They could preserve their way of life, cling to their traditions, and maintain a certain degree of autonomy. However, it also meant they were more vulnerable to external threats. With the Habsburgs imposing their will on the region and religious tensions still simmering beneath the surface, the people of this town were never truly free. They were at the mercy of forces beyond their control, forces that could sweep through their village at any moment. This tension between independence and vulnerability may have contributed to the sense of fear that gripped the town in the late 1600s. The residents, already living on the fringes of society, may have begun to feel the weight of the political and religious pressures that were slowly tightening around them. They were no longer living in a world of simple survival and tradition. They were now caught in a larger struggle, one that could have catastrophic consequences. But it wasn't just political and religious forces that created an atmosphere of fear. Superstition, too, played a major role in the lives of the people. The dense forests surrounding the town were a place of mystery and danger. The Bohemian countryside, rich with folklore and ancient beliefs, was a place where witches, spirits, and curses were believed to lurk in the shadows. The villagers, living in such close proximity to these dark, mysterious forces, would have been deeply affected by the prevailing superstitions of the time. In such a setting, it's easy to imagine how rumors and fears could take on a life of their own. It's possible that the people of the town began to believe they were under some kind of curse, perhaps brought on by the supernatural forces that were believed to haunt the forests. It's even possible that the town's isolation and the sense of being forgotten by the outside world contributed to a growing paranoia. What was happening in the world beyond the borders of their settlement? Was the town being forgotten on purpose? Were they being abandoned, left to their fate, as the political and religious winds shifted outside their control? By 1699, something had changed. The town, once a part of the everyday fabric of Bohemian life, had become a place of silence. What had once been a bustling community of people now found itself in an existential crisis. Why did they choose to disappear from the maps? What made them decide to remove themselves from history, to sever all ties with the world beyond their village? This decision, shrouded in mystery, can only be understood in the context of the time. The late 1600s in Bohemia was a period of profound instability. The Habsburgs were tightening their grip on the region, religious and political tensions were high, and the memory of the 30 Years' War still loomed large. The people of this town were caught between these forces, living in fear and uncertainty, with no clear way out. In this environment, it's not difficult to imagine that the residents of the town may have felt they had no choice but to erase themselves from history. Was it a way of protecting themselves from outside threats? Was it a desperate attempt to escape the grasp of the ruling powers? Or was there something more sinister at play, something darker and more mysterious? The decision to remove the town from all maps is not just an act of isolation, it is a profound statement of fear and desperation. The people of this town were not simply withdrawing from the world, they were vanishing from history itself. In many ways, this disappearance mirrors the broader uncertainty of the time. Bohemia, and much of Europe, was caught in the throes of a larger, uncontrollable crisis. The old ways of life were being swept away, and people were struggling to find their place in a world that seemed to be changing at an alarming rate. For the people of this town, disappearing from the maps may have seemed like their only option in a world that had left them behind. But in doing so, they became a part of history's dark, forgotten corners, forever lost to time, but never fully erased from our collective memory. The late 17th century was a time of fear, superstition, and profound uncertainty. For the people of this town, living in the shadow of past wars, under the watchful eye of the Habsburgs, and surrounded by a world full of dark and mysterious forces, the decision to disappear from the maps may have been their only way to regain control over their fate. It was an act of defiance, yes, but also an act of survival. And in the silence that followed, the town's legacy became not one of victory or defeat, but of mystery and the unknown. Nestled deep within the rugged hills of Bohemia, this town, whose name was later to be lost to the ravages of time, existed in a setting that, by its very nature, seemed designed for secrecy. The town sat at the edge of the forest, surrounded by towering trees that twisted and gnarled with age, their thick canopies filtering the sunlight into an almost perpetual twilight. The landscape was wild and untamed, offering both a sense of safety from the outside world and a stark reminder of the dangers lurking in the natural world. It was in this remote, isolated environment that the people of the town found themselves cut off not only from the broader kingdom but also from the outside world's events that often seemed a distant dream or nightmare. For centuries, towns like this one had thrived in isolation, with little interference from the larger political machines that governed Bohemia. The roads to and from the town were treacherous, often only passable by foot or by cart, and the villagers had little reason to venture beyond the borders of their familiar landscape. There were no grand merchant caravans passing through, no royal decrees to heed, no soldiers or diplomats to make their presence known. The town was a small community, built around a church, a few humble homes, and perhaps a market square where farmers and craftsmen gathered to trade. Life here was hard and simple, centered around the cycles of nature, planting, harvest, and the bitter cold of winter. For these people, the town was more than just a physical location. It was their sanctuary. It was a place of comfort and safety in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. And yet, despite its isolation, the town was not untouched by the currents of history. In the late 1600s, Bohemia had been in the grips of political and religious tension. The Habsburgs, the imperial family that ruled over much of Central Europe, had long sought to consolidate power and impose Catholicism upon the Protestant regions of the land. This imposition had caused tension and strife, both in the cities and in the more rural communities. At the time of the town's disappearance from the maps in 1699, the Habsburgs were at the height of their power in Bohemia, and the monarchs were determined to bring all parts of their realm under control. The Church, too, played an outsized role in governance, and the demands of both state and faith often weighed heavily on the people. It is within this atmosphere of mounting pressure from the state and the church that the town's decision to remove itself from the historical record must be understood. Yet the question remains, why did they choose this drastic step? What was it about their circumstances that led them to take such an extreme measure? One theory suggests that the town, being located in such a remote and isolated area, had become a sort of refuge for people seeking to escape the control of the monarchy and the church. It is possible that this town had become a sanctuary for those who did not conform to the rigid structures of the Habsburg Empire. Perhaps some of the villagers had been part of the Protestant resistance to Catholicism, or maybe they were simply weary of the constant pressure to conform. The church, with its inquisitions and accusations of heresy, loomed large in the lives of Bohemian citizens. For a town on the fringes of the empire, any perceived dissent could result in severe punishment, ranging from exile to execution. In this context, it is conceivable that the people of this town decided that the only way to ensure their survival was to erase themselves entirely. Removing their name from the maps, severing all ties to the outside world, would make them invisible. It was an act of radical self-preservation. By removing their very identity, they could disappear from the radar of both the state and the church. But in doing so, they also created a void where their legacy should have been. They chose to become nothing, a place that no longer existed in the eyes of the authorities, in the eyes of history itself. While the political and religious pressures were surely a factor, there are other theories that might shed light on the strange decision. Some suggest that the people of this town were not simply trying to avoid political persecution or religious condemnation. Rather, they were trying to escape something even more terrifying, something that may have been rooted in the supernatural. Bohemia, with its dense forests and shadowy traditions, was a land steeped in ancient folklore, and superstition was an integral part of everyday life. The town, tucked away in its isolated setting, may have been a place where such beliefs ran deep. In the late 17th century, Bohemia was rife with stories of witches, demons, and the supernatural. The countryside was believed to be haunted by malevolent spirits, and dark rites and rituals were thought to be carried out in the deep woods. For the people of this town, it is possible that their decision to remove themselves from the maps was born out of a fear of something they could not understand or confront. There may have been rumors of strange happenings, disappearances, unexplained phenomena, or even the presence of otherworldly forces. In such a setting, it would not be surprising if the townspeople believed they were cursed or trapped in some kind of dark fate. It is said that when people are faced with the unknown, they often resort to extremes. In this case, the villagers might have believed that if they could sever all ties to the world, they would be free of whatever dark force was haunting them. They may have thought that by erasing their identity, they would break the curse, free themselves from the supernatural threat, and avoid the malevolent forces that lurked in the forest. The act of removing their name from the map could have been seen as an attempt to erase the curse itself, to start anew as though they had never existed in the first place. Of course, this theory is speculative, and there is no concrete evidence to suggest that the town was truly beset by supernatural forces. But the idea that the people of the town were motivated by fear of something beyond human understanding is one that speaks to the deep psychological effects of isolation. The psychological toll of living in constant fear of the unknown, of being surrounded by a vast, dark forest that seemed to hide secrets and dangers, could have pushed the villagers to take this extreme step. As we consider these possibilities, it becomes clear that the town's decision was likely not a single act, but rather the culmination of years of mounting tension, both from external pressures and from internal fears. The people of this settlement were not simply trying to survive the daily struggles of life, they were trying to escape the weight of a world that was rapidly changing, a world in which they no longer had a place. The remote, isolated location of the town may have provided some degree of safety, but it also left them vulnerable to the forces beyond their control. The decision to disappear, to remove their name from existence, was an act of desperation, a final attempt to escape the pressures of their time and their environment. As the years went on, the town began to fade from memory. Its name, once a marker of its existence, was no longer spoken. The roads leading to it were overgrown with vines, and the once bustling marketplace became a silent ghost town, devoid of life. The people who had lived there were gone, their legacy erased. But despite their efforts to disappear, the town has never truly been forgotten. It remains a ghost in the annals of history, a mystery that continues to haunt the collective imagination. And while its name may have vanished from the maps, the questions it raises about fear, survival, and the unknown continue to linger, unsolved and unresolved. In trying to understand the reasoning behind the town's decision to erase itself from history, one must grapple with the deep, unsettling tension that existed in Bohemia at the time. The year was 1699, and the people of this obscure settlement were faced with choices that seem unimaginable today. The question that looms large is, why would a community, seemingly ordinary in every way, choose to disappear so completely? Why would they wipe their name off the map, severing their ties to both the present and the future, condemning themselves to oblivion? The most plausible explanation begins with the environment of fear and uncertainty that surrounded the townspeople. Bohemia in the late 17th century was a region marked by social, political, and religious turbulence. The Habsburg monarchy, which ruled over the region, was bent on consolidating power, imposing a uniform Catholic identity upon the land. This was no small matter, particularly in a land where Protestantism still had a stronghold in many regions. The 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, had already scarred the people of Bohemia, leaving them weary, paranoid, and distrustful of any force that threatened to further disrupt their fragile way of life. After the war, Bohemia was under the control of the Catholic Habsburgs, whose attempts at religious and political centralization further alienated the people. For many, the very idea of submitting to the monarchy was anathema to their sense of identity, autonomy, and faith. In this context, it is not hard to imagine that the town, located on the outskirts of civilization, had become a hotbed of resistance. Perhaps it was a place where those who opposed the monarchy or resisted Catholic domination sought refuge. Hidden away in the deep forests, the town was far from the watchful eyes of the imperial authorities. It is possible that the townspeople saw themselves as a sort of last holdout, an enclave of defiance against the royal and religious forces that sought to control them. They could have been involved in underground Protestant movements, or perhaps they were simply farmers and artisans who longed for a life free from the endless demands of state and church. The threat of persecution for nonconformity was ever present, and as the Habsburgs expanded their grip on the region, the risk of retribution grew ever more real. It is also important to consider that, at this time, a growing sense of fear permeated the psyche of the people living in rural Bohemia. The intense religiosity that pervaded the region was not only a matter of faith, it was also a matter of survival. The villagers of Bohemia lived in a world where religion was intertwined with every aspect of life. The church wielded immense power, and the fear of excommunication or being labeled a heretic was very real. For a small, isolated town like this one, the risk of attracting the attention of religious authorities was ever present. The Inquisition had already made its mark across Europe, and the people of Bohemia were not immune to its reach. Accusations of heresy, witchcraft, or even just simple dissent could lead to brutal consequences: torture, execution, or exile. These harsh realities would have made any sign of rebellion or resistance a dangerous endeavor. Perhaps the townspeople, caught in this whirlwind of political and religious oppression, realized that their very survival hinged on their ability to remain unseen, to disappear from the maps of the world. What better way to protect themselves from the eyes of an unforgiving monarchy and a brutal church than to erase their very existence? By making their town invisible, they could escape the grasp of the authorities. This act of self-erasure could be seen as an ultimate form of rebellion, a statement that they would not be crushed by the weight of empire, that they would not bow to the religious or political forces that sought to control them. But there is more to this story than simply political defiance. The decision to remove the town's name from the maps could have been driven by something far more sinister, something beyond the realm of politics or religion. Theories abound suggesting that the people of the town may have been fleeing something more than the oppression of the Habsburgs or the Church. Some scholars and theorists have suggested that the town was facing a deeper, more existential threat, one that perhaps transcended earthly forces. Could it have been a belief in supernatural forces that compelled them to act? Could the town's residents have believed they were cursed, or that their fate was sealed in some otherworldly way? Bohemia was, after all, a land steeped in mysticism and superstition. Folklore was not just a matter of entertainment, it was woven into the very fabric of everyday life. The people of this region were steeped in tales of witches, demons, and spirits that roamed the forests. Supernatural forces were a constant presence in their lives, both feared and revered. The forests themselves were considered to be haunted, filled with spirits of the dead and other dark forces that could not be understood by the light of reason. It is not difficult to imagine that the townspeople, living in this charged environment, may have believed that their village was cursed. Perhaps they were living under the weight of an ancient curse, one that was tied to the land itself, or perhaps they had fallen victim to an unseen force, something that could not be defeated by the sword or the church's blessing. In such an environment, it is conceivable that the decision to erase the town's name was seen as an act of liberation. If the town was indeed cursed, then its people might have believed that by severing all ties to the world, they could escape the grip of the supernatural forces that haunted them. By removing themselves from history, they would free themselves from whatever dark power held sway over their lives. This belief in the power of erasure could have been rooted in ancient rituals that aimed to sever ties with the forces of evil. Perhaps the villagers believed that by destroying their connection to the world, by making their town invisible, they could break free from the curse that had been placed upon them. Theories surrounding the supernatural nature of the town's disappearance are, of course, speculative. There is no concrete evidence to suggest that the town was truly cursed, or that the townspeople were fleeing from ghosts or spirits. However, the presence of folklore and superstition in Bohemia cannot be ignored. The land was rife with stories of the supernatural, and in such an environment, it is entirely possible that the villagers could have believed that erasing their name from the maps was the only way to escape the forces they feared. Whatever the exact cause, the decision to disappear from the maps was undoubtedly a bold, desperate move. It was an attempt to escape the oppressive forces of the time, whether political, religious, or supernatural. The act of removing themselves from history may have seemed like the only way to regain control of their own fate, to protect themselves from a world that seemed increasingly hostile and unknowable. And in their silence, in their disappearance, they became a symbol of resistance, both to the authorities and to the unseen forces that may have driven them to act in the first place. Yet, in the end, the town's decision to erase itself remains an enduring mystery. Was it a political statement, a religious act, or a supernatural response to an unseen evil? The truth may never be fully known. What we are left with is the haunting silence of the town that chose to vanish, a place that no longer exists on any map, but whose story continues to resonate through the corridors of time. As the years passed and the town's name vanished from the maps, it became a mere whisper in the annals of history. What had once been a thriving, albeit isolated, settlement, now existed only in fragments of fading memories, rumors, and the occasional mention in obscure records. The disappearance was not a single, catastrophic event, but rather a slow, deliberate fade from the consciousness of the surrounding region and the larger world. To this day, no one knows exactly when or why the town completely slipped into obscurity. Yet, the eerie silence that followed the erasure is perhaps as telling as the disappearance itself. It was not merely the absence of a name, but the absence of any trace of its existence that has baffled historians, archaeologists, and curious minds alike. The immediate aftermath of the town's disappearance was one of uncertainty and confusion. The people of the region, especially those who lived in nearby villages, were left to wonder what had happened to the once thriving community. For generations, this town had been a known entity. Its name had appeared on maps, its presence felt in the social and economic life of the area. And then, without any announcement, without any public explanation, the town simply ceased to exist. The roads that led to it were overgrown, its landmarks vanished, and the people who once called it home were gone, with no record of their fate. At first, it seemed as though the town had simply been forgotten, erased from the official records by the whims of a few powerful forces, perhaps political, perhaps religious. The town's name was no longer included in the maps that guided travelers, traders, and government officials. But as time wore on, and the town's absence became more pronounced, strange questions began to arise. What happened to the inhabitants? Had they truly vanished, or had they been absorbed into other settlements? Could they have fled to escape some larger threat, political or otherwise? And if so, why was there no trace left of their departure? This gap in history, this absence of any meaningful trace, was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the town's disappearance. For one, there were no mass graves found, no remnants of a brutal conquest or natural disaster. There were no records of disease or famine wiping out the population. The town had simply ceased to exist, and yet it had left no physical evidence behind to explain its fate. This void, this silence, only deepened the mystery. Scholars who have investigated the town's disappearance have uncovered a few scraps of information, fragments of old manuscripts, accounts from travelers passing through the region, and references in the writings of local historians. But nothing conclusive has ever been found. One theory suggests that the town was intentionally abandoned, its inhabitants choosing to flee in the dead of night, without a word to anyone. Yet this theory raises more questions than answers. If the town was simply abandoned, why would the residents leave without leaving any trace? Why would they go to such lengths to remove all records of their existence? Another, more unsettling possibility is that the town was destroyed, either by a natural disaster, an external enemy, or even an internal uprising. The lack of physical evidence, however, makes this theory difficult to support. It's highly unusual for a town to disappear without leaving behind at least some remnants, some mark of destruction. No burned buildings, no collapsed walls, no scattered bones. The eerie emptiness left behind points to something far more perplexing than the simple ravages of time or war. Could the town have simply dissolved into thin air? Could its very existence have been erased in a manner that defies logical explanation? Despite the mystery, there are hints in the historical record that suggest the town's disappearance was not the result of a natural disaster or a military invasion. The surrounding villages, as well as the local authorities, seem to have been puzzled by the town's sudden absence. In the years following its removal from the maps, there were no reports of refugees from the town being found in neighboring settlements, nor were there any documented mass migrations to other parts of Bohemia. It's as if the entire town, along with its people, had simply evaporated, leaving behind no witnesses and no survivors. This strange silence has led some historians to suggest that the town was deliberately erased not just from maps, but from collective memory. The question then becomes, why? What kind of force or power could have compelled an entire community to vanish from history, leaving behind no trace of its existence? Some theorists suggest that the people of the town may have been victims of a government or religious purge, a concerted effort by those in power to erase a community that had become a symbol of resistance or defiance. But if this was the case, why would the authorities go to such lengths to make it seem as though the town had never existed at all? The absence of records in the official archives is also highly suggestive of this idea. Throughout the history of Bohemia, records of towns, villages, and settlements were meticulously kept by local authorities, church officials, and the monarchy. It was nearly impossible for an entire town to simply disappear without leaving behind any trace in official documentation. Yet, no birth certificates, tax records, or legal documents have ever been found to indicate that this town existed beyond a certain point in time. The only remaining evidence of its existence are the faint mentions in scattered texts and the occasional reference in local law, leading some to speculate that the town may have been deliberately erased from the historical record in a way that only the most powerful forces of the time could achieve. One of the most perplexing aspects of the town's disappearance is that there were no attempts by outsiders, whether local authorities or neighboring towns, to search for answers. In a world where governments kept close tabs on the movements of people and towns, the complete erasure of an entire settlement would have been a highly suspicious event. Yet, as the years passed, the town's absence became something that the surrounding villages seemed to accept without question. No investigations were launched, no inquiries made. The town simply ceased to exist, and life went on, as though it had never been there in the first place. The lack of any organized effort to uncover what happened to the town has led some to believe that those in power, the monarchy, the church, or other influential groups, may have played a part in the town's disappearance. Perhaps, it is suggested, the people of the town had angered those in power so greatly that their erasure was deemed necessary. Whether through political, religious, or personal motives, the decision was made to eliminate all traces of the town from memory, as though it had never been part of the landscape at all. This theory, however, raises even more unsettling questions. Could such a massive, coordinated effort to erase the existence of a whole community be carried out in such a covert manner, without the cooperation or awareness of the wider population? How could something so monumental, so dramatic, be swept under the rug with no outcry, no public reaction? The silence surrounding the town's disappearance is as haunting as the disappearance itself, and it leaves us with the nagging feeling that we will never truly know the full story. The eerie absence of the town, its people, and any evidence of its fate continues to linger in the collective imagination. What could drive an entire community to erase themselves so completely from history? And what force, or forces, could have been behind such a strange, terrifying act of obliteration? These questions remain unanswered, and as time passes, the town drifts further into the realms of legend and myth, leaving behind only fragments of a story that will never be fully told. As the years turned into centuries, the story of the town that vanished from history began to take on an almost mythical quality. The mystery surrounding its disappearance continued to captivate the imagination of historians, folklorists, and even conspiracy theorists, each attempting to unlock the secrets behind this unsettling chapter in Bohemian history. But despite the many theories that have emerged over the years, the true reasons for the town's erasure remain elusive. The lingering question is not just one of what happened to the people who lived there, but why the town's very existence was wiped from the map. What could have motivated such an extreme, deliberate decision? And why, for all the intrigue surrounding the town, is its fate so completely shrouded in silence? One of the most perplexing aspects of the town's disappearance is the seeming indifference with which it was treated by the outside world. In a time when communities were closely monitored and accounted for, and when records were kept in meticulous detail by both the church and the monarchy, how could an entire settlement simply cease to exist without a trace? The erasure of the town from the official maps and records would have required active participation from those in power, whether local authorities, church officials, or even the monarchy itself. This is what makes the town's disappearance so puzzling. It wasn't just the absence of a name, but the absence of any tangible record of its existence. Even in a time of upheaval, where war and famine were commonplace, the disappearance of a town would have raised eyebrows. Yet, the silence that followed its removal seemed to suggest that the powers that be were either complicit in the act or simply willing to turn a blind eye to it. One possible explanation for the town's disappearance lies in the complex political and religious dynamics of the time. Bohemia, in the late 17th century, was still grappling with the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that had ravaged much of Central Europe and left deep scars on the people and the land. The Habsburgs, who ruled over Bohemia, had consolidated their power in the wake of the war, and their rule was characterized by efforts to centralize authority and impose religious uniformity. The Habsburg monarchy, which was staunchly Catholic, sought to bring all regions under its control and eliminate Protestantism wherever it had taken root. This was particularly true in Bohemia, where the population had once been deeply Protestant, but had been subjected to increasing pressure from the Catholic rulers. For a town that had once been part of this religious and political struggle, it is possible that its erasure was a form of punishment. Perhaps the town had become a symbol of resistance to the Habsburgs' religious policies, or maybe it was a site of dissent that posed a threat to the monarchy's authority. If the townspeople had openly defied the rule of the Habsburgs or resisted the Catholic Church's influence, it is conceivable that the monarchy, seeking to quell any opposition, decided to erase the town from a historical record. By wiping out its name, they would have been sending a clear message that resistance would not be tolerated, that those who defied the crown could be erased without a trace, as though they had never existed at all. However, this theory raises further questions. If the town was truly a center of resistance or disobedience, why would the people themselves have chosen to erase their identity rather than continue their fight? Why would they have taken such an extreme step to vanish completely, rather than face their adversaries head-on? The decision to erase their name from the maps and sever all connections to the outside world seems to indicate a deeper level of fear, a fear that went beyond the mere threat of political or religious retribution. It suggests that the people of the town were not just trying to avoid punishment or persecution, they were trying to escape something far more terrifying, something that might have been outside the realm of human control. This leads to another intriguing theory, that the town's disappearance was not solely a result of political or religious forces, but rather an attempt to escape a more mysterious, perhaps supernatural, threat. Bohemia was, after all, a land steeped in folklore and superstition. The dense forests that surrounded the town were believed to be inhabited by spirits, demons, and other malevolent forces. In a world where the supernatural was often seen as an undeniable part of reality, it is possible that the people of the town believed they were cursed, or or that some dark force had taken hold of their lives? Could it be that the decision to remove the town's name from the maps was a desperate attempt to break free from an unexplainable and terrifying presence? The people of Bohemia in the late 17th century were no strangers to superstitions and fears of the supernatural. Witchcraft trials had been widespread, and the belief in curses, hauntings, and demonic influences was common. It's entirely possible that the townspeople, living in such a charged environment, began to experience strange occurrences that they could not explain. Perhaps they believed that their town had been touched by dark forces. Perhaps they even saw signs of the supernatural in their everyday lives. The decision to disappear, to wipe their name from history, might have been seen as an act of self-preservation, a way to sever ties with the supernatural entities they believed were hunting them. In this context, the act of erasure becomes not just political or social, but metaphysical. The town wasn't simply trying to escape the reach of the monarchy or the church. They were trying to escape the grasp of something much darker, something that could not be confronted with force or logic. This theory is, of course, speculative. There is no direct evidence to suggest that the town was ever plagued by supernatural forces, but the context of the time, the deep-rooted superstition and the pervasive belief in curses, makes it a plausible explanation. In a world where the lines between the natural and supernatural were often blurred, it is not difficult to imagine that the people of this town might have believed that their very existence was under threat from dark, unseen forces. The forests, which were seen as places of mystery and danger, could have been perceived as the dwelling place of evil spirits. If the people of the town were living in fear of such forces, it might explain their decision to completely sever themselves from the world. Another possibility is that the town's disappearance was part of a larger, more systematic effort to conceal something even more sinister. Perhaps the people of the town had uncovered a dark secret, a secret so terrifying that they felt it could not be allowed to remain in the public eye. Could there have been a hidden history of betrayal, violence, or forbidden practices that the residents wanted to escape? The fear of their town being exposed to the outside world may have driven them to erase all traces of it, even if it meant sacrificing their own identity. In this scenario, the town's disappearance would have been a deliberate act of self-censorship, a way to protect themselves from the consequences of revealing a buried truth. This theory touches on a broader theme, the idea of erasure as a form of control. By removing themselves from the historical record, the townspeople were exercising the ultimate form of agency. They were making themselves disappear, rendering themselves invisible to the forces they feared. In this light, the town's decision to vanish was not just a reaction to external pressures, but an assertion of control in an otherwise uncontrollable world. In a time when everything from identity to survival was subject to the whims of powerful institutions, the act of self-erasure becomes a statement of autonomy, a way to carve out a space of freedom by disappearing entirely. Ultimately, the town's fate remains an enigma. Whether driven by political rebellion, supernatural fear, or a dark secret, the decision to vanish from the maps and from history is one that speaks to the desperation and fear of those who made it. The people of the town sought to escape, to disappear, and to make themselves invisible, leaving behind no evidence of their existence, no footprints in time, and no record of their names. In doing so, they have left us with a mystery that continues to haunt the imagination, a puzzle that may never be solved. The town may no longer exist in any tangible sense, but its story, in all its ambiguity and intrigue, remains a powerful reminder of the lengths to which people will go to escape forces beyond their control, whether those forces are human or supernatural. As time marched on and the town faded further into the shadows of history, its disappearance became a source of intrigue not just for historians, but for anyone fascinated by the mysteries of the past. Over the centuries, the tale of the vanished settlement has been told and retold, morphing into a legend that seems almost too bizarre to believe. But within this legend, there are fragments of truth, pieces of a story that are still buried in the past, waiting to be uncovered. The town's absence, its erasure from both maps and collective memory, has prompted countless theories, each more speculative than the last. Yet, despite the proliferation of ideas and conjecture, one thing remains clear. The town's disappearance was not a simple case of neglect or natural disaster. There was a deliberate intent behind it, and it speaks to a larger human desire for control, survival, and perhaps escape from forces beyond understanding. One of the most haunting aspects of the town's vanishing is the eerie silence that followed. In a world where communities were tightly knit and records were meticulously kept, how could a town simply vanish without anyone noticing? After all, settlements like this one were not isolated in the sense that they existed completely outside of the broader social fabric. The town would have been known to local authorities, to neighboring villages, and to traders passing through the area. And yet, despite the visibility of such places, there are no surviving accounts from the time that speak to the town's fate. There are no diaries, no letters, no official documents that describe the event, or even allude to the disappearance. In a sense, it was as if the town had never existed in the first place, as if someone had erased it from both memory and history. This absence has sparked the imagination of many. Could the disappearance have been the result of a secretive government action? Some theorists suggest that the Habsburg monarchy, known for its strict control over Bohemia, might have been involved in erasing the town as part of a larger effort to suppress dissent. At the time, the Habsburgs were consolidating power, pushing the Catholic agenda, and silencing any signs of Protestant resistance. The town, which had long been a haven for those who resisted the monarchy's religious policies, may have become a target for the state. The decision to remove the town from the maps, then, might have been a means of erasing a symbol of defiance, an act of political retribution disguised as a simple administrative change. But if this was the case, why would the inhabitants have agreed to disappear voluntarily? Wouldn't the people have fought back, resisting the erasure of their very existence? It is here that the mystery deepens. The town's disappearance was not a violent purge, nor was there any evidence of mass arrests, executions, or even forced relocation. There were no reports of fleeing refugees or survivors who could shed light on what happened. It was as though the entire settlement had simply chosen to vanish, perhaps even willing participants in their own disappearance. This raises the unsettling possibility that the residents were complicit in their own erasure, an idea that runs counter to most historical accounts of resistance and rebellion. One theory that seems to align with this voluntary disappearance is the idea that the people of the town were simply weary, worn down by years of political and religious strife, by the constant threat of persecution, and by the weight of an oppressive system that seemed to crush every attempt at autonomy. For these people, perhaps the decision to remove themselves from history was not just a matter of survival, but of personal liberation. It might have been their way of reclaiming control over their own destiny in a world where they had little power. By erasing their town from the records, they were, in a sense, making a statement that they could not be controlled by the state, the church, or any other authority. In a world where everything, identity, existence, and survival, was controlled by external forces, the act of self-erasure could have been seen as an ultimate act of defiance, an assertion of freedom even in the face of overwhelming odds. But even this theory does not fully explain the complete absence of evidence surrounding the town's disappearance. After all, there were neighboring settlements, towns, and villages that would have noticed the town's absence. Wouldn't the people of these places have spoken out, especially if something so extraordinary had occurred? And yet, there is no record of any such outcry. The silence is deafening, and it suggests that whatever happened to the town was so shrouded in secrecy that even those who lived nearby were either unaware or unwilling to speak of it. Was there a conspiracy of silence? Were the surrounding communities complicit in the town's disappearance, or were they simply too afraid to ask questions? Another possibility is that the town's residents were swept up in some kind of mass psychological event. Could it be that the people, overwhelmed by the stresses of their political and religious climate, began to experience a collective psychological breakdown? The pressures of living in such a turbulent time, facing both external oppression and internal fear, could have caused the inhabitants of the town to develop a shared delusion, a belief that the only way to escape their situation was to disappear completely. This psychological phenomenon, known as mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria, has been documented throughout history, and it's not inconceivable that the people of the town, under extreme duress, may have decided that they needed to erase themselves from existence as a means of coping with the overwhelming forces that surrounded them. In this scenario, the act of self-erasure becomes a kind of collective madness, a desperate attempt to escape the pressures of reality. The town's disappearance was not a calculated political act, nor was it a supernatural response to a curse. It was a shared psychological response to a world that had become too terrifying to endure. And yet, even this theory does not fully explain why the town's name was removed from the maps, why the settlement was erased from official records. If the town's disappearance had been a psychological reaction, why was it so complete, so final? Why was there no lingering trace, no sign that the town had ever existed at all? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the town's erasure was part of a much larger, more far-reaching plan, one that went beyond the confines of a single settlement and extended to the very fabric of history itself. Could it be that the town's disappearance was orchestrated by powerful forces that sought to manipulate not just the political and religious landscape, but the very record of the past? In this view, The town's erasure becomes a piece of a larger puzzle, an intentional alteration of the historical record, a deliberate attempt to wipe away evidence of a certain reality and replace it with something more controllable. If this theory holds any truth, it suggests that the people of the town were not merely erasing themselves from history, they were being erased, a part of a greater historical rewriting. But why would such an extreme action be necessary? What was so threatening about this particular town, this particular community, that it warranted such drastic measures? And who would have the power to carry out such a task, to remove a settlement from the pages of history and ensure that no trace of its existence would survive? In the absence of answers, the town's disappearance continues to haunt the minds of those who seek to understand it. Theories abound, each one more speculative than the last, but none of them can definitively explain the events that led to the town's erasure. Perhaps the truth will never be known. Perhaps the town is meant to remain a mystery, a blank spot on the map of history, forever concealed in silence. The story of the vanished town is a haunting reminder that there are forces in the world, political, psychological, or even supernatural, that can erase entire communities from existence, leaving behind only shadows and whispers. The town may no longer be on any map, but its mystery endures, a symbol of the ways in which history can be shaped, erased, and rewritten by forces beyond our understanding. As the centuries unfolded, the town that had vanished became a topic of fascination for scholars, writers, and curious individuals drawn to its enigma. What had once been a community with its own name, culture, and history had become a blank space, both physically and in the annals of history. The silence surrounding the town's disappearance was not just a historical anomaly, it became a powerful symbol of what could be lost to time, and how easily history could be manipulated or forgotten. The absence of the town in modern-day records is a chilling reminder of the power of erasure and the fragility of human memory. But beyond this sense of loss, there remains an undercurrent of curiosity, a question that refuses to fade with time. Why was this particular town erased? Why did it vanish when countless other towns survived? And why is it that, despite its complete disappearance, the town's legacy continues to haunt the minds of those who stumble upon its forgotten story? One of the most compelling aspects of the town's mystery is the lack of any definitive explanation. Historical records of the time are sparse, and what little evidence remains is fragmented, pieced together from the occasional mention in local histories or vague references in obscure documents. It is as though the town never existed beyond a fleeting moment in time, its existence reduced to a mere footnote in a broader historical context. Yet, despite this, the town's story continues to captivate those who encounter it. The mystery seems to transcend time, becoming a narrative that invites speculation, investigation, and theorizing. The question of why the town was erased remains at the heart of many of these theories. Was it simply a matter of political expediency? The 17th century was a time of intense upheaval in Central Europe, and the pressures of war, religious conflict, and political consolidation were deeply felt in Bohemia. The Habsburgs, in particular, were focused on maintaining their grip on power, and the centralization of authority was a constant goal. The Catholic monarchy, eager to impose uniformity in religious practice and political allegiance, may have seen the town's existence as a threat to its control. If the town was a bastion of Protestant resistance or a center of anti-Habsburg sentiment, its removal from the historical record might have been a calculated act of suppression. By erasing the town's name, the monarchy could have symbolically crushed any potential threat, severing its ties to the larger resistance movement. However, this theory, while plausible, still does not account for the strange circumstances surrounding the town's disappearance. After all, political repression in Bohemia during this period was not unknown, yet towns and villages that resisted the monarchy's influence did not simply vanish from existence. They were often repressed, punished, or forced to conform, but their names and locations remained part of the record. In this case, however, the town's erasure seemed to go beyond the typical forms of political punishment. It was as if the town's name had been deliberately erased, its very identity obliterated, as though it never existed in the first place. If the town's erasure was not solely the result of political machinations, could there have been other, more personal motives at play? Could it be that the people of the town had chosen to disappear for reasons that went beyond political defiance or survival? The possibility of a voluntary disappearance raises intriguing questions about human agency and the desire to control one's own fate. In a world where external forces, be they religious, political, or societal, often dictated the terms of survival, the act of erasing one's existence could have been seen as an ultimate form of liberation. Perhaps the people of the town, fed up with the constant pressures of conformity, repression, and uncertainty, decided to take control of their own destiny. By removing their name from the maps, they could escape the watchful eyes of the authorities and, in doing so, regain a measure of autonomy. This theory suggests that the town's inhabitants were not merely victims of external forces, but active participants in their own disappearance. It proposes that the act of self-erasure was, in essence, an act of resistance, not to the political or religious authorities, but to the very concept of being controlled by anyone at all. By choosing to vanish, the people of the town may have been making a statement about their own agency, rejecting the idea that their lives were subject to the whims of a distant monarch or a powerful church. This notion of self-erasure as a form of freedom raises unsettling questions about the lengths to which people will go to reclaim their autonomy in a world that seeks to subjugate them. While political or personal motives may explain the town's decision to disappear, another layer of mystery emerges when one considers the supernatural theories surrounding its vanishing. As mentioned earlier, Bohemia in the 17th century was a land steeped in mysticism and superstition. It was a time when the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were often indistinguishable, and the idea of curses, dark forces, and unseen entities was not only accepted but feared. The dense forests of Bohemia were thought to be inhabited by spirits, demons, and otherworldly creatures, and the belief in witchcraft and the occult was pervasive. Could it be that the people of the town had encountered something far darker than political or religious persecution, something that could not be explained by earthly forces? Perhaps they were not simply fleeing from the monarchy or the church, but from something more sinister, something that threatened their very existence. The idea of a supernatural curse or an unseen evil that haunted the town is not far-fetched, given the historical context. It is entirely possible that the people of the town believed they were cursed, or that they were being hunted by malevolent spirits. In a world where the line between reality and the supernatural was often blurred, the idea that the town's disappearance was the result of a dark force cannot be dismissed. In this scenario, the people of the town's decision to disappear would not have been motivated by political or religious pressure, but by a desperate desire to escape a supernatural presence that they could not confront or understand. By erasing their town from the maps, they might have believed they were severing their ties to the dark forces that had taken hold of them. In this sense, the act of self-erasure becomes a ritualistic attempt to break free from the curse that had seemingly marked their lives. It was not just an escape from the world of men, but from the world of spirits and demons, a way of asserting control over a reality that was spiraling into something beyond human comprehension. Whatever the true reason behind the town's disappearance, the fact remains that it remains one of the most unsettling mysteries in history. The idea that a whole community, in the midst of a turbulent era, could decide to erase itself from existence challenges our understanding of both human behavior and the forces that shape history. The town's vanishing is a haunting reminder of the ways in which history can be manipulated, erased, or forgotten. It raises profound questions about the nature of memory, identity, and power, and the lengths to which people will go to protect themselves from forces that are beyond their control. The town may no longer exist on any map, but its story endures. It lingers in the minds of those who are drawn to its mystery, a ghostly echo from a forgotten time. The people of the town may have chosen to disappear, but their story continues to captivate, haunting the collective imagination and reminding us of the power of erasure and the fragility of history itself. Whether driven by political motives, personal desires, or supernatural fears, the town's disappearance remains a chilling reminder that, at the end of the day, history is as much about what is lost as what is remembered. As the centuries passed, the town's mystery deepened, evolving into a subject of almost mythic proportions, captivating historians, curious onlookers, and conspiracy theorists alike. The question of why the town had disappeared, and why its name had been wiped from every map, remained unanswered, but the allure of the unknown kept its story alive in the hearts and minds of those who stumbled upon it. Perhaps no answer would ever fully satisfy the curiosity that surrounded the town's disappearance, but this very uncertainty, the absence of clear, verifiable facts, has given rise to a plethora of new questions, many of which point to the larger issues of history itself: memory, erasure, and the manipulation of collective identity. The tale of the lost town serves as a stark reminder that history, as we know it, is not a fixed, immutable truth but a narrative shaped by those who hold power.